Happy protesters gather around the prison where Otto Sandhuber is held, a famous American writer of the early 1900s. Slowly, he starts to narrate the incident that locked him away behind bars. A story of a young housewife, Dolly Osterich, married to a successful businessman, Fred Osterich, who dealt with textile manufacturing nationwide. Their first encounter immediately left Fred in great admiration for Dolly. Not long after, Fred decided to climb the altar with Dolly. The movie is portrayed to have been a true-life story of Walburger Osterich, also nicknamed Dolly Dolly. The story takes place around the time of 1920 till 1955. Following the event after their marriage, Dolly would soon be left feeling dissatisfied about her marriage and sexual life, leading her to committing one of the most common sins in our everyday society, only slightly to a higher level. One morning before getting ready for work, Fred comes downstairs to greet his wife Dolly. She shows him one of her latest designer work she copied from a French magazine and hopes her husband Fred could sell it, but he refuses, saying his customers were not from Paris. Later that day at work, Dolly shows some of her co-workers her sewing work, as they talk about remodifying it a bit. Otto walks in and begins working on his sewing machine. Dolly picks up a book and reads, after which hearing from her co-worker that Otto was a writer, but Otto snatches the book from her hands, explaining fancy ladies didn't read those. At night, after playing cards with his mates and showing off Dolly, Fred sleeps away, forgetting to play the sensual activity of the night with Dolly. That gets her rather thoughtful. The next morning, Dolly tries to convince her husband to take her to a particular event so he can have her at any time of the day, but Fred gets upset. He strangles her by the neck, making it clear that he wasn't bargaining to make love with her. Little did Fred know that Dolly would want to taste life then end up in a loveless marriage. Sometime later, Fred congratulates Dolly on her apron making small sales. Dolly says she wouldn't be able to finish the designs because her machine was broken, and Fred should send a repairman to fix it. A few days later, Otto stopped by on his bicycle. Turns out he's the repairman sent by Fred. While he walked up to the Osterich stairs, he greets their friendly neighbor. Dolly opens the door for him to fix her sewing machine. While doing so, she extends her leg close to Otto to remove her shoe. Otto has already fallen for her and can't resist her temptation. She later asks Otto to take off his clothes, which the boy did with vigor. He asks if she would take off hers, but instead she tells him next time, and in order for there to be a next time, he would have to come every day to fix her sewing machine while Fred was at work. Otto is absolutely thrilled by this, and comes every day to Dolly's manor. He quickly becomes a yes man to her, as she uses most of his lustful desires to get to him. Subsequently, they even have a hormone sandwich after foreplaying around the house. Otto thinks Dolly should get a divorce, as he doesn't want to share the same bed with a married woman. Dolly cheerfully refuses his advice. She explains she doesn't want to go bankrupt and poor like her mother did, so all Otto needed to do was please her and they would be alright. The following day, Dolly needed to make things right with her neighbor, Mrs. Clarkson, who had been seeing Otto coming in and out of her home. She uses the opportunity of Mrs. Clarkson's son's birthday to tell that Mrs. Clark Otto was her brother, who has helped from time to time. But Fred, her husband, doesn't like seeing Otto. Mrs. Clarkson was ignorant, but was really accepted this lie of Dolly. Otto comes to visit Dolly the next day. She takes him to the attic where she convinced him to live there. Finding out Otto was an orphan and had no immediate family, the world would never know he even existed, adding to the fact that he would be having her sweet body every day. She plans to pay him, and he would never have to work again as a repairman. As for Otto, who told the story, he explained Dolly was good at locking a man up and making him imagine it was paradise. Further explaining, he didn't know if Dolly was playing him or not, but either way, she made him so dizzy he didn't care either way. That very night, Otto hears the couple's screams as they made love right beneath his nose. He felt like he should rush in there and give Mr. Osterich a piece of his mind. In the morning, avoiding the windows like he was told to, he saw a glimpse of Fred leaving the house to work. Immediately, Dolly rushes in to greet him. Otto grabs her by the bosom and undresses her like she pleased before having a sandwich with him. During the day, she asks Otto to write a book about her, so later when they were famous, people would know she inspired him. Otto agrees to this. Dolly then goes out to get groceries and leaves the entire house to Otto. Otto goes around the house playing and pretending to be Fred by wearing his coat. He knew that if he wasn't able to write a good book, Dolly would get him kicked. So instead, he decided to use their affair as a story to tell. Later, he reads part of his story to Dolly in the bathtub. She likes it and promises to get it published after finishing it. Otto is excited. He jumps into the bathtub with her and they have another round of hormone stimulus. The following evening, after sharing their bath together, Otto cooks for Dolly, but before the two could eat the food, Fred comes home from work. Dolly is forced to take Otto back into the attic while she goes to welcome Fred. Fred comes inside and perceives the aroma of the food. He says it's better than all the garbage Dolly has been making for him ever since. Dolly gets heartbroken but doesn't show it. While they ate, Fred asks for his remaining pie in the kitchen. Dolly tells him he ate it, and he should take a good look at the mirror before very soon they wouldn't make his sizes of clothes anymore. Fred gets angry and smacks her. After a couple of years, Otto managed to successfully live inside the attic for 4 years without having Fred find out. Although he explained they were close calls when Fred almost noticed him. He further explained how he kept Dolly happy while Fred was away, like she needed them both to coexist. One morning, Dolly comes to celebrate with Otto for staying with her for 4 years. She plans to take him out after showing him news from a publishing firm that would want to get his book published. The two go out that evening to celebrate at a club, but after a while, Otto begins to hallucinate and wishes to go back home. Back home, he makes Dolly confirm that there is still hope for the both of them. Due to this, Dolly then makes sure that Fred has life insurance as soon as Fred got home. Fred also plans to take Dolly out. When Dolly is preparing to leave, Fred comes in, causing Otto to hide under the bed while watching her husband give Dolly a very expensive necklace. From Otto's narration, he hated it as he watched Fred take Dolly out. When they got to the party, Dolly becomes the center of attraction. Numerous men wanted to dance with her while Fred watched from behind. Moments later, he gets enough of it, and angrily goes to cut Dolly short and pull her out of the dancing floor. Outside the party, Fred nags about Dolly flirting with all the men. Dolly assumes she likes dancing, and Fred doesn't. Fred doesn't care and takes her home. Meanwhile, Otto is relaxing on the couch when the couple gets home. Fred notices him run, so he rushes upstairs to get his gun against the intruder while Otto makes his way through the back. By the time Fred arrived downstairs, Otto was already gone. That night, Otto had to spend his evening with a homeless drunkard out on the street. He knew Dolly had him so hooked to her he couldn't do anything about it, but he knew he should do something about it. The next morning he returns to Dolly. She is happy to see him. They quickly kiss and she gives him a bath. She also gives Fred's gun just in case of protection. The following week, Dolly goes to Fred's insurance company just to make sure Fred pays his life insurance so her and Otto wouldn't need to suffer if Fred is gone. Turns out he did, and she had nothing to worry about. Fred takes Dolly out of town for dinner so she could forgive him. Dolly looks around the place, but Fred assumes she's already flirting with guys around. He becomes angry this time around and reminds her in a harsh way that she would never become an actress, and she would never go to Hollywood, and she would never sleep with any famous actor. Everyone around looks around at the both of them, but Dolly has had enough. She doesn't care anymore. She explains to Fred she would rather drink to death if the only option was to remain with him forever. The both of them argued till they got back home. The argument became so serious that Otto in the attic comes downstairs, pointing the gun to Fred and asking him to let go of his lover. Fred realizes Otto has been living with him for the last 6 years. He jumps at Otto to get his gun, but Otto defended himself. They both fall to the ground, and while struggling, Otto manages to shoot Fred. He knows the neighbors would hear the gunshot, so he pretended it was a robbery by taking Fred's watch, smacking Dolly, and locking her into a closet. When the neighbors got into the apartment with the police, they unlocked Dolly from the closet. Dolly tells them it was a robbery. The detectives aren't so sure about that because whoever the robber was, he didn't touch the cash in Fred's wallet. The next morning, Dolly is called to station. Detective Herman thinks there's something wrong with the death of Fred. He asks her some questions about her marriage, and Dolly answers it perfectly fine. After a while, she wishes she would leave the station. Another time, Dolly celebrates with her newly found boyfriend, Mr. Roy, who is in charge of her insurance. Otto hears them having a hormone sandwich, so he comes downstairs to see for himself. He's disappointed and goes back up. Later, he scolds Dolly for sleeping with Roy. Dolly says she needed to make sure her insurance money was attainable, so she had to make sacrifices. She managed to calm Otto down by having a sandwich with him, and besides, they were moving to Hollywood, which was good news. Many years passed, and the two are now famous in Hollywood. Otto wants a marriage, but Dolly doesn't want that yet. She claims she had a lot of work to do before marriage. Even when Otto tries, she tells him a lot of people would take his job of writing in a big house and having a hormone sandwich with her all day. Meanwhile, Mr. Roy, Dolly's insurance agent, goes to visit Dolly, but finds out her house was out for sale. Knowing he had been tricked, he goes over to the station to turn in the gun and tell on Dolly. 2 weeks later, Dolly plans a party. She invites many Hollywood stars. Otto doesn't like the fact that all her attention is taken away by her attorney, Mr. Herman, so he creates a distraction that gets everyone following him and laughing. Later, she scolds for doing something like that because it could jeopardize his safety. Otto is upset that all Dolly does is go about flirting and sleeping with men. He climbs upstairs in anger. Dolly gets a call from Detective Klein. He said he wanted to see her. She gets him an appointment and ends the call. Otto doesn't like this. He tries to convince Dolly to leave the country with him, but Dolly disagrees. She wouldn't want to live like a fugitive, and moreover, she's making the kinds of friends she deserves, Dolly said. She makes Otto very upset, so he stomps back upstairs. Few days later, Detective Klein visits Dolly. He explains to Dolly her insurance agent who she slept with told on her. He even brought Fred's gun, but Dolly denied all the accusations dealing with the gun and Mr. Roy to the detective. Her attorney, Mr. Herman, is there to support her, and also take words from the detective's mouth, causing Mr. Klein to leave the mansion. Later, Dolly thanks Mr. Herman for helping her get rid of Klein by giving him her husband's watch. Otto watches and gets heartbroken by this. Later that night, Dolly apologizes to Otto, saying all that she is doing is for his benefit. Otto doesn't care, because he assumed Dolly didn't love him anymore. She'd only used him for a slave for her pleasure. Dolly tries to deny that and seduce him, but he pushes her off him. Otto decided to do things the right way now. Sometime later, Mr. Herman takes Dolly out and proposes to her. Dolly accepts his proposal, then later they go back home, kissing themselves. Otto comes down and ends their lovemaking. He threatens Herman with a knife while revealing who he was to him. A lover and a slave, who Dolly put in her attic to please her. Herman is very disappointed at Dolly. Dolly denies it, but the men don't listen to her. Herman gets his ring off her finger and leaves. Otto confesses that he already called Detective Klein and he was on his way to the house. Dolly is devastated. She reminds Otto he shot Fred, but either way, what had been done had been done. Shortly after, the cops show up at their doorstep. Otto is taken into custody, and Dolly is taken too a while after. Mr. Herman, Dolly's attorney, visits her in prison. He informs her that Otto's lawyer would be painting her as a puppeteer and Otto as a puppet, so most of the blame could fall on her. He also informs her that both Otto and her would be tried together. Their trial comes. Dolly is first accused by Otto's lawyer of seducing Otto, who was only a teenager then. He said Dolly fed Otto with thoughts of killing her husband, Fred Osterich, and running away with the insurance money over Fred's life. Dolly claims that she never intended to hurt her husband, but Fred was abusive and she had kept Otto in the house to make her feel comfortable. Dolly says Otto was driven by the fictional books and characters he made up, saying maybe those were the things that made him think he could murder Fred. When it was Otto's trial, Mr. Herman broadly explains that Dolly did Otto a huge favor by letting him stay in her house, but Otto once again, driven by the fictional love stories he wrote by himself, made him into believing something more could exist between him and Mrs. Osterich. Thereby, all crimes he committed had nothing to do with Mrs. Osterich, but all inside his imaginations and lust. After their trial, the jury finds Otto guilty of manslaughter and sentenced him to prison, but didn't reach a verdict for Dolly Osterich. Immediately, the officers take Otto away. When he comes in close range with Dolly, nothing is said between the two, but with Dolly's expressions, she felt terribly affected by this. One could say she really had feelings for Otto Sandherber. A story based on a true life event, the actual individuals these characters were played on happened to have different endings. Otto Sandherber was released soon after sentencing because of the statute of limitations, then after, moving to Canada to complete his stories. As for Dolly, she took up with various men and finally married 2 years before her death in 1961. This is Dennis Stories Recap.